Welcome to this video tutorial on how to make simple concept diagrams in Rhino 7. For this tutorial I'm going to be using this site model I've set up here, and then for this site model I've used some data that I've downloaded from Digimaps in order to get the 3D massing and also some 2D geometry of the outlines of this scene and also the topography of this area too. I'll put a link to the description of some videos that go through this process in the link of this video as well. So for this particular tutorial we're going to be taking a series of diagrams from this 3D model, and I've set out a kind of series of concepts for my building proposition, which starts with this excavation of a part of the terrain on the site. Then we've got a simple piece of massing we're showing here. The next stage is the building height, which we're adding on, and then the final stage is the addition of this courtyard, which actually cuts out from those two initial pieces an area at the back of the site. And I want to show each of these diagrams in sequence so we can have a series of 3D views of our site showing the process of how the design has formed through the concept stage of the project. Now to do that I've sort of set up each of these series in their own layers, so I'm able to turn them on and off. And what we're going to start by doing is picking a view that best shows each of these layers so we can have a consistency for all of our diagrams. So to do that I'm just going to kind of spin around my view, and it might be you want to go to your properties panel and change from a perspective projection over to a parallel one. This will mean that your lines will be parallel to one another and will have no perspective acting on them, and sometimes this looks a bit cleaner for when you're trying to do diagrams or sort of simple building models that might kind of need to be at a simpler kind of rate. So you can use the perspective projection in order to get that. And I think once I've picked my view, I think around there, somewhere which can get all of my different sort of objects in frame nicely, I'm then going to save that view so we don't lose that. And to do that, we're going to go to View, Set View, and Named Views here. Under Named Views, we can clip that just to the side of our layers by clicking and dragging it in. And you can hit on the Save button to save a view. And I'm just going to call this one 3D View there. Now this is saved, what we're going to do is we're going to take a series of Make 2Ds to get a 2D drawing from our 3D view. And we're going to do that in series. So we're going to start with our site with none of our kind of massing on. We're going to take a Make 2D of this. And once we've done our Make 2D, there's a few options we need to tick. We first need to make sure it's in the correct view. The second thing we want to make sure is that we maintain the source layers. And what this will allow us to do is it will keep the layers that the models are currently objected and modelled on, and that will mean we can then switch them to a layer with a correct line weight for each of those objects, so we can have a hierarchy and a line weight for each of the objects in our scene. So we're going to maintain the source layers. We're also going to add in a scene silhouette, which will give us a nice outline to this model, which we can use to have a thicker border to our 3D model. And we're also going to click Group Output and Viewport Rectangle to give us a kind of rectangle of the view as well. So once we've set those settings, we're going to hit OK, and it will then generate a Make 2D for us. And we can find that if we just go back to the top view, we then have our Make 2D file here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move it across and down so it's out of the way, because quite often the Make 2Ds will drop in the same location and you don't want them to get caught up on top of one another. And there you can see they've contained or kept the lines that I've started them on, so they're on the site massing, etc. So I'm just going to go through now and we're going to turn on each of the layers in turn and do a second Make 2D for that. And it's going to be exactly the same process as the first one, and once it's made we'll just go back to the top view and make sure we sort of move it into position. So I'm just going to pause the video and do it for the other two options. Now we've done that series of Make 2Ds, you'll then see we've got our sequence here with each of our drawings. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to change the line weights and layers of these particular lines when I Make 2D, so we can attribute a particular line weight to each of those layer colours. So we'll have a line weight for our buildings, our kind of street lines, our terrain, and our kind of concepts there. To do this, I've set up a series of 2D lines in my layers folder. And in these 2D lines, each of them have a different print width attributed to them. So this will give a line weight to each of my lines in my Make 2D. And all I'm going to do now is we're just going to move my lines from my Make 2D file, which is found at the bottom of my layers here, and we can find the sort of building models under these visible curves, and we're going to just move them into a layer in my 2D line work layer. So for this site massing, I want it to be a relatively thin line weight, so we're going to move it to one of these elevation lines, which has a print width of a 0.13. So to do that, we can just right click on the layer that the Make 2D is selected in, go to our properties and change that layer to one of our pre-made 2D layers up here. We're going to put it on the elevation mid, and I'm just going to go through all the lines in here and do that for each of the layers. So we're just going through selecting the objects and moving it onto their correct layer to give them a line weight. Now I've done that for all of my visible lines, but we still have these scene silhouette curves, which is the outline that gave us in our Make 2D. And if I turn off my curves and my visible options here, we'll be able to see that outline there. And you'll find that actually in some points it's a little bit broken up and we might have to redraw some of that. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to start by putting this all on one layer. So we're just going to select our scene silhouette curves, and they might be sort of all in the bottom here. So let's just select them like so. We'll deselect our frame for now, and we're just going to move them onto our kind of thickest line weight, which is this section, thick line. Now what I'm going to do is we're just going to turn off my other layers, so we're just going to lock them actually, so that we don't accidentally draw in them. And then I'm just going to tidy up the rest of that line, and we only need to do it in one view because we can then just copy it over to the rest of our views as well. So sometimes you might want to just go in and delete the extra lines, other times it's actually quicker just to redraw the whole piece. For this particular one, I think it's actually going to be quicker for me just to sort of redraw these areas. So I'm just going to take the polyline tool here, and we're just going to kind of redraw this edge so we have a nice bold outline. And I'm just going to pause the video while I do that so we can redraw that edge. Now that outline's been completely redrawn, as per here, we can then just delete the other outlines, making sure we don't accidentally select the frame, and then just copy this one over. And I'm just going to use a common point, so the kind of point of the model down here, to just make sure I copy those in place, like so. And there we have our kind of 2D drawings ready to go. And now, because they're on their correct layers with line weights attached to them, we can now just set up a layout sheet to hold all of these and display those particular line weights we've set. So I'm just going to click on the plus down here, create a new layout. We're going to call this 3D diagrams. And I'm just going to set up an A2 landscape page for this with an initial detail count as 1, and hit OK. And you'll see when you do that, it will try and contain all the objects within your kind of file on this page. Now I don't need my kind of site plan and my 3D model there, so I'm just going to select the frame, just drag the tabs down to get rid of that. And we're just going to kind of move this upwards. So we've got these in the middle of the page. It might be, if you want to make them slightly bigger, you can double click within this frame and then you can sort of zoom in and out. I think actually mine are pretty well centered in there. And also if you want them to scale, if you're doing kind of flat plan drawings or a kind of drawing that you want to scale, you can set that by selecting this detail frame, going to your properties and typing in your scale value here. But for these 3D diagrams, I'm not going to give them a scale. Now to see the particular line weights I've set for this, we can turn on what's called the print display. And if you would just type in print display into your command bar, set the state to on and turn it on there, we can then see those line weights that are attached to it. And it might be that you now want to go back and change some of these, so we might make the outline a little bit thinner just in the print width here. You might want to change some of your other line weights, and you can kind of experiment with those however you want them. But because we've added them to all the layers, it will mean that all of my lines have those line weights attached to them now. So now we've done that, we're going to export this out as a PDF, and we're going to bring it in to Illustrator to add a little bit of colour to some of these pieces, and then we're going to try and overlay some rendered shadows onto these diagrams to finish them. So to export this as a PDF, I'm just going to right click on my 3D diagrams, hit print, and we're going to make sure we're set as a Rhino PDF. landscape and a vector output there, and then I'm going to hit the print button. That will ask me then to save it as a PDF, and we can choose a location to save that. So I'm just going to click save there. And now that's saved, we're going to now open up Illustrator and import that PDF into an Illustrator file. Now I have Illustrator open, I'm going to locate my PDF file, and we'll just click and drag and drop it into this top bar in Illustrator to open that up. And once that's open, we'll then see our page layout with our diagrams on them. It might be here that you also find that your line weights are a little bit big. I think mine come in okay, so I'm going to keep them as they are for now. Now what we're going to do is we're going to first just explode and break out these lines out of the group that they've come in when we have imported them in. What you'll find, if you click on one of these lines, it will sort of select the whole group, and we can just go up to this clip group in the top left hand corner, select the edit contents button, and then I usually just cut the content and paste in place to bring it back. Then what you can also do is, if you just select your cursor around the edge of this, you'll select two kind of invisible frames which will come from that Rhino export, and we can delete those as well. So now we have our four diagrams with our editable lines, and if we want to change the line weight of any of these, we can select one of the lines, hit on this select similar objects, and you can select all of them in the file, and then we can adjust the line weight accordingly. So I could kind of bring that down if I wanted to, and we could kind of adjust some of these to other weights if we needed to as well. So you can always go around and just sort of adjust slightly the line weights if you need to on those. Once we're happy with those, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to make a separate artboard for each of these diagrams. The reason for this is when I export this and put it into my portfolio, it might be I want to lay them out in a vertical motion, or it might be you want to lay them out in a square. Maybe you don't want them horizontal as they're currently displayed. So by giving them each their own artboard, we'll have the flexibility to lay them out however we want to as individual images. To do that, I'm going to go to Document Setup, Edit Artboards here, and we're just going to click and drag this first one to snap it onto the edges of that frame that we exported out to. And we should just be able to snap to that frame. You might have to zoom in to get it snapping on. Once you've got that, on your Layers tab, just make sure you've locked your layers so none of the objects move. And we're then just going to hold down the Alt key, just making sure that that's snapped in as well. It's always good to check that these are exactly on the lines. And once we've got that, we're going to hold the Alt key down and just click and drag the artboard. And I'm not going to try and line it up at this point. I'm actually going to just copy it over first, and then we're going to line up the objects afterwards, like so. Then we can unlock our tab, we can click off the artboards and then line up our objects to our board, and I'll just usually try and find the top corner and snap it on like so. And you just want to go around and do that for all of these, so they're all snapped into place. Once we've aligned these, we can actually delete that outer frame because we don't need that anymore. That was purely there just to help us align the views. So I'm just going to delete those frames. Now we've got our kind of line weighted diagrams all on their own artboards, and what I'm going to try and do now is just add a little bit of colour to these drawings using Live Paint in Illustrator. To do that, I'm actually going to make a copy of these lines first, and we're going to just copy them, just going to edit and copy, make a new layer, put it below my first layer, and we're going to call this layer Paint. We'll call the above layer Lines, and we're just going to paste in place those objects on the paint layer. So I've got kind of two versions of them now, one on top of the other there. Now they'll look the same, but what we'll do is we'll lock the lines layer, and I'm just going to select all the objects on that paint layer, and we're going to remove any line weight on them. So we're just going to go to the stroke panel down here, and we'll just hit the remove button so we have no line weight. What you'll see is if you hide the lines layer, they'll just be invisible. The lines will still be there, but they won't have a colour or a line weight to them. We won't be able to see them. Now with those, I'm going to go to the Shape Builder tool. We're going to hold down the left mouse button, and under there we'll find the Live Paint Bucket tool, and then we can click on our objects to make this a live paint group. And what that will mean is it will allow us to select a colour and then fill in that colour on our objects like so. Now the reason I split the paint group and the lines is that I'm now able to individually still select my lines on my object, and I can use the live paint group, because the live paint group automatically groups all the lines together, so it's much harder to tweak any individual lines or move them around once you've made it. So by splitting them in this way, we have the option of doing that. Now for this, I'm just going to add a bit of colour to my site and to my kind of concept buildings to make these stand out. So let's just find a nice kind of orange tone, and we're just going to add this in to our kind of particular site area here. We're going to add the same one to the other pieces just for consistency, and then I think we'll add a tone. Let's add a sort of blue tone for the building here. Make sure we've got no line weight on there. And I'm just going to go in and use the live paint tool here to fill in some extra colours onto this model. And you could do this for the whole of the model if you wanted to add colour across the whole piece. You could do this just for a small selection. You might use it to sort of focus the viewer in on certain aspects of the model that you want to highlight. It's kind of completely up to the sort of aesthetic you want to get. Sometimes what I'll do with this is I might then take that blue and we might kind of select a brighter shade and just fill in the sort of top faces in a slightly brighter shade to give it some three-dimensionality as well. So you can always kind of use different tones of the colour to represent different things. For my courtyard here, I'm actually going to give it a slight sort of green tone, so we can highlight that as well. And I'm going to do the same thing here, where we'll have a slightly darker shade on this face. So there we've got our kind of 3D diagrams all drawn out. And once we've got those finished, I'm then going to just save this file as an Illustrator file. So we have this saved if we want to go back and change anything. And then I'm also going to export this out as a series of images. And to do that, we're just going to go to Export, Export As. We're going to select a JPEG for this process, and we're going to make sure we tick the Use Artboards here. And what that will do is if we hit Export, it will save those out as a series of single images. And we can find those in our file here, where we have each of our artboards there with our image in place. So for that, it's kind of saved each one as their own artboard, which will then allow us to kind of move them around if we want to bring them into our portfolio later. Now for the last part of this tutorial, we're just going to then combine a rendered sort of shadow layer on top of this diagram to add a bit of three-dimensionality to this piece. To do that, we're going to render a shadow in our Rhino view, and then we're going to combine it in Photoshop. So I'm going to go back to my 3D view here. I'm going to turn off my line work, so we're just in our sort of 2D file again. Make sure that we're on the correct view by just double clicking on that named view again, and then we're just going to set up a quick render for this. So to do that, we're going to go to the render panel, go to render properties here. Make sure the current renderer is set to Rhino render for this. You can also use V-Ray or the legacy render for this as well, but for this particular version we're going to just use the Rhino render, because all I want is a kind of white model with some dark shadows on it. Make sure you've set your dimensions here. If you want it quite a high resolution, you might want to up the resolution of the image. I'm just going to keep it around this value for now, and we're going to set it to final quality at 300 dpi. Now don't worry about the backdrop for this, we're just going to go down to the lighting, and all we want for this example is just to have the sunlight turned on, so we have a strong shadow in our model. We're going to turn off the skylight because that will brighten up the image a bit too much. And then we're just going to hit on the sun settings to set the sun to a particular kind of angle. Now it might be that you've set your model to a particular kind of orientation, and if you've downloaded the data from Digimaps, it will automatically be set to north. That means if you hit and turn off the manual controls, we can actually set it to a particular location. So I could set it to London, for example. We could set it to a particular time and date here, so it matches that as well. So you have the option of doing this manually just by turning on those manual controls and setting the height and the location of the sun there, or we can set it to a particular place on the earth if you want to match a certain location that your project's taking place in. Once that's done, we can hit OK on our render, and I always do a save just before we do a render, just in case the file crashes. A lot of time rendering can take up a lot of processing power on your PC, so it's always good to save it before you render anything. And we'll just do a render preview first to have a look and see how those shadows are looking. So there we can see those shadows across the model, and I think I might slightly tweak that before we render it, so I'm just going to go back to the render properties, and we can always do a couple of previews, tweak the lighting just to get it to the right angle that we need before you render it. I'd always recommend tweaking the lighting slightly so you're making sure you're getting the correct angle for what you want for your model. And when you're happy, you can do a render preview just to check again, and that's looking quite nice there. So I think that's working well. Once we're happy with that, we can then go to render and render the full image out. And depending on your computer, this may take a long or shorter period of time. You'll see here, because we've set it to final quality, it's going to count down up to 1,500 samples. And if you want the highest quality, you want to leave it until it reaches that value. You can stop it beforehand if you think the quality is where you want it to be. And as you'll see, it starts off quite noisy and it will get kind of a higher and higher quality as we let that number go up. So I'm going to pause the video and let that render out. Now that's finished rendering, I'm going to save it out just by hitting the save icon up here, and we're just going to save that out as a JPEG image as well. And call it shadows. So now we have those two images, we're going to open up Photoshop and combine them together using an overlay feature. We're going to start by just taking the diagram that the shadows relate to and just dragging and dropping it into this top bar in Photoshop. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take our shadow layer here and we're just going to drag and drop it on top of that image there. Now what you might find is that if you're lucky, it might kind of automatically overlay like this, and I'm going to just reduce the opacity. Mine does automatically overlay because we matched our kind of 2D to our viewport. If you bring it in and your shadows aren't exactly the same size as the image, they might be a bit smaller like this, you might have to manually scale them up to match them. To do that, what we can do is you can hit the Control T to transform. We can move the shadows into a location where they match, i.e. this kind of corner point here, and then we can move that crosshair in the middle of the image down to match that corner point, like so. If you can't see this crosshair, you'll have to turn it on using this tick box up here, and once you've sort of aligned it correctly to that point, you can hold the Alt key on your keyboard and then drag from the corner to line it up, and then we can just sort of zoom in to check that's lined up, and the Alt key will lock the transform position to that location you've chosen. So once it's lined up, we're then just going to put the fill back up to 100, and then we're going to change the blending mode to a multiply blending mode. Then all we need to do is lower that fill color until you get the shadows overlaid correctly, and on a multiply it will allow the lines from below that image to come through those shadows and show clearly on top. It might be you also might want to color tint the shadows, and you can do that by going to the adjustment layer, putting on a hue saturation adjustment, hold down the Alt key between that hue saturation and the shadows to clip them together so this only works on the shadows, and then I usually just go to colorize and make this a sort of slight shade of blue. And this is sort of personal preference if you want your shadows slightly color toned like so, so we can give them a slightly blue tone there. So that was just a quick video tutorial on how to make a series of 3D diagrams using Rhino, Illustrator and Photoshop. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and if there are any other videos you want to watch on rendering skills or drawing skills in Rhino and V-Ray, please check out the videos on the channel.